A billionaire tried to buy a royalguards, dignitizing $100 bills at him, convinced that everyone had a price. But with one firm, unshaken grip, the guard made the entire crowd gasp, and in seconds, all that money meant nothing. Here's how his ego came crashing down. Before we begin, make sure to hit that subscribe button and leave a like on the video now. Let's get into it. Asterisk, you know, I've seen a lot of things in my time covering stories around London, but nothing quite prepared me for what I witnessed that crisp October morning outside Buckingham Palace, the kind of morning where the autumn air bites just enough to make you appreciate the warmth of your coffee, where tourists huddle in their jackets and snap endless photos of those iconic red uniforms, standing motionless against the palace gates. It was around 10:30 a.m. when the black Rolls-Royce Phantom came screaming round the corner of Constitution Hill, not the dignified purr you'd expect from such a vehicle, but an aggressive roar that made every head in the crowd turn. The car lurched to a stop, right in front of the gates, double parked, without a care in the world for the traffic building up behind it. The door swung open, and out stepped Max Sterling III. If you don't know the name, you should. Fourth richest man in Britain, inherited daddy's tech empire, and somehow managed to triple it by the time he was 35. The kind of man who bought football clubs for fun and dated supermodels like they were seasonal accessories. That morning, he was draped in what I later learned was a custom Brioni suit that cost more than most people's cars, with diamond cufflinks that caught the morning sun like tiny stars. But it wasn't his expensive threads that caught my attention. It was the way he moved, like he owned every square foot of pavement. His Italian leather shoes touched, like the world was his personal playground, and everyone else was just there for his entertainment. Sterling stood there for a moment, adjusting his tie, basking in the attention he'd already drawn from the crowd. Tourists were whispering, pointing, some already pulling out their phones. He loved it. You could see it in the way his chest puffed out, the way his lips curved into that practiced smile rich men use when they know they're being watched. Standing directly in front of him, maybe 10 feet away, was Corporal James Calloway, of the Queen's Guard, 12-year veteran, 2 tours in Afghanistan, and one of the most disciplined soldiers I'd ever seen. I'd been documenting the changing of the Guard for months, working on a piece about tradition in modern Britain, and Calloway had always struck me as the embodiment of what the Guard represented. Stoic, unwavering, dedicated to something bigger than himself. He stood there in his scarlet tunic and bearskin cap, rifle at his side, eyes fixed on some distant point that only he could see. The morning sun cast long shadows across his face, highlighting the weathered lines that spoke of a man who'd seen more than most. His hands, steady as stone, gripped his weapon with the confidence of someone who'd carried it through places where a moment's hesitation could mean death. Sterling approached him with the swagger of a man who'd never been told no in his entire privileged life. The crowd sensed something was about to happen. The steady murmur of conversation died down to whispers, then to almost complete silence. Even the street vendors seemed to pause their calls. "Morning, soldier," Sterling said, his voice carrying that particular brand of condescension that only comes from inherited wealth. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a crisp £100 note, holding it up like a magician, displaying a card trick. "Bet you don't see this in your paycheck, do you?" The crowd stirred uneasily. A few tourists laughed nervously, not sure if this was part of some elaborate performance or genuine disrespect. But those of us who knew better, who understood what that uniform represented, felt our stomachs tighten. Calloway didn't move, didn't even blink. His eyes remained fixed on that distant point, his breathing steady and controlled. If he'd heard Sterling's words, he gave no indication. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire. Sterling's smile faltered for just a moment, before reasserting itself with renewed vigor. He waved the money in front of Calloway's face, close enough that the paper almost brushed against his nose. "Come on, Tin Man, just blink for me, that's all. One little blink, and this 100 is yours." The crowd was growing now. Word was spreading through the usual gaggle of tourists and locals that something was happening at the palace gates. Phones were coming out, cameras focusing on the spectacle. Sterling noticed the growing audience and seemed to feed off it, his voice getting louder, more theatrical. "Tell you what," he continued, pulling out another bill, then another. £500 to scratch your nose, 1,000 to smile. Hell, "I'll make it 10,000 if you take a selfie with me." Gasps rippled through the crowd. £10,000. For most people watching, that was months of salary. Life-changing money. A young mother clutched her child closer, whispering explanations about why the man was being so rude. An elderly gentleman in a flat cap shook his head in disgust. A group of American tourists looked around, confused, unsure if this was normal behavior or something to be concerned about. But Calloway remained unmoved. His military bearing, honed through years of service and sacrifice, was unshakable. He'd stood guard through rain and shine, through protests and celebrations, through the mundane and the historic. He'd watched over the crown jewels, protected royalty, and maintained the dignity of centuries of tradition. A wealthy man with too much money and too little sense wasn't about to break that resolve. Sterling's face was beginning to flush. The easy confidence that had carried him into this confrontation was starting to crack. He was a man accustomed to getting his way, to having doors opened and obstacles removed by the simple application of money. That the guard wasn't even acknowledging. His presence was clearly frustrating him beyond measure. He reached into his jacket again, this time pulling out a thick wallet. The leather was buttersoft, probably Italian, definitely expensive. He began counting out bills with exaggerated flourishes, making sure the crowd could see each note as he added it to the growing pile in his left hand. 20,000, he announced, his voice carrying across the courtyard. £20,000. Do you know what you could do with £20,000? New car, nice holiday, down payment on a house, all for breaking character for 30 seconds. The crowd was transfixed. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about something deeper, something that cut to the heart of what we value as a society. Here was a man who believed that everything and everyone had a price, that dignity and duty were just words that could be bought and sold like any other commodity. A young boy, maybe 8 years old, tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mummy," he whispered, his voice carrying in the sudden quiet, "is the soldier going to do it?" The mother looked down at her son, then back at the scene unfolding before them. She was dressed modestly, probably saved 4 months for this family trip to London. Her face showed the kind of concern that comes from understanding that her child was witnessing something that would shape his understanding of right and wrong. "No, sweetheart," she said softly, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "He's not going to do it, because some things aren't for sale." Sterling heard her words and turned, his face now noticeably red. The perfect composure he'd maintained was slipping. "Oh really?" he called out to the woman. "Everything's for sale, love, everything. You just haven't met the right price yet." The crowd reacted with a mixture of shock and anger. A few people started to voice their disapproval, but Sterling was far from finished. He turned back to Calloway, the pile of money in his hand, now substantial enough to choke a horse. 50,000, he said, his voice carrying a note of desperation disguised as bravado. £50,000. That's more than you make in a year, probably more than you've ever seen in one place. All you have to do is acknowledge that I exist." But Calloway didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even shift his weight from one foot to the other. He stood there like a living statue, a monument to something that Sterling couldn't understand and certainly couldn't buy. The silence stretched on. Seconds ticked by like hours. The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Sterling's hand trembled slightly as he held the money, not from the weight of the bills but from the weight of a lifetime of expectations crashing down around him. For the first time in his privileged life, Max Sterling III was facing something that money couldn't solve, and he was completely unprepared for it. A bead of sweat rolled down Sterling's forehead despite the cool morning air. His breathing was becoming more labored, more obvious. The crowd could sense his growing frustration, and some were beginning to enjoy it. Here was a man who'd probably never been denied anything in his entire life, and a simple soldier was making him look like a fool without saying a word. That's when Calloway moved. It was so subtle, so minimal, that half the crowd missed it entirely. His eyes flicked down, just once, to the money scattered at his feet. Then, with movements so deliberate they seemed choreographed, he bent down and picked up a single £100 note. The crowd held its breath. Sterling's face lit up with triumph. "There we go," he exclaimed. "I knew you'd come round. Everyone has their price, don't they?" But Calloway wasn't finished. With the same deliberate precision he'd used to pick up the bill, he tore it cleanly in half. The sound of ripping paper seemed to echo across the courtyard like a gunshot. The crowd erupted, not in cheers or applause, but in something deeper, a collective intake of breath that spoke to something fundamental about human dignity. Sterling's face went from triumph to shock to something approaching rage in the space of seconds. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Sterling screamed, his composure finally, completely shattered. "That's real money. That's £100. Calloway let the torn pieces of the note fall to the ground. Then, for the first time since Sterling had approached him, he spoke. His voice was quiet, controlled, but it carried across the courtyard with the authority of someone who'd commanded respect in places where respect was earned, not bought. "My oath isn't for sale, sir," he said. The word "sir" delivered with just enough edge to make it clear that it was a courtesy, not a sign of deference. "Now kindly step back." The crowd was dead silent. Even the traffic seemed to have stopped. Sterling stood there, mouth agape, staring at the torn money at his feet, like it was a personal insult to everything he represented. Then he laughed. It was a high, forced sound that rang hollow in the morning air. "Oh, he's good," he said, turning to address the crowd like he was hosting a variety show. "Very good. All right, you want to play games? Let's play games." He reached into his jacket again, this time pulling out his phone. A gold iPhone, naturally, with a case that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. He opened what looked like a banking app, his fingers flying across the screen. £100,000, he announced, holding up the phone so the crowd could see the screen. "I'm transferring £100,000 to whatever account you want, right now. All you have to do is break character for 30 seconds. The crowd was stunned. Even those who'd been firmly on Calloway's side found themselves holding their breath. £100,000. It was an impossible amount of money for most people. Life-changing money, generational wealth for some families. But Calloway didn't even look at the phone. His eyes remained fixed on that distant point, his breathing steady, his posture perfect. If Sterling's offer had any effect on him whatsoever, it was impossible to tell. Sterling's face was getting redder by the minute. The easy confidence he'd started with was long gone, replaced by something ugly and desperate. "Are you kidding me?" he shouted. "Are you actually kidding me? It's £100,000. What's wrong with you?" An elderly man in the crowd, a veteran by the look of him, stepped forward. He was probably in his 70s, wearing a worn military blazer with faded ribbons on the chest. His voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of experience and authority. "Nothing's wrong with him, son," the old man said, his voice cutting through Sterling's rant like a blade. "He's doing exactly what he's supposed to do, what he swore to do." Sterling turned on the old man, his face contorted with rage. "Oh, spare me the patriotic nonsense, Grandad. Everyone has a price. Everyone." The old veteran looked Sterling up and down with obvious distaste. "No, son, not everyone. Some things can't be bought. Some things are earned." The crowd began to murmur its approval. Sterling was losing them, could feel the tide turning against him. The entertainment value of his spectacle was wearing thin, replaced by genuine disgust at his behavior. That's when he made his final, desperate play. "500,000, Sterling screamed, his voice cracking with strain. £500,000. That's $500,000. You could buy a house, multiple houses. You could set your family up for life." The crowd was no longer just watching, they were participating, and not in the way Sterling wanted. Voices rose from different parts of the gathering, a chorus of disapproval that grew louder with each passing second. "Leave him alone," someone shouted from the back. "You're embarrassing yourself," called out another voice. "Get out of here," Tosser yelled a young woman near the front. But Sterling was beyond hearing them. He was trapped in his own bubble of disbelief, unable to process that his money, his power, his entire worldview was being rejected by a man who made in a year what Sterling spent on a good bottle of wine. He began pulling out everything he had, credit cards, jewelry, even his expensive watch. "Look at this," he shouted, holding up a Patek Philippe that probably cost more than most people's cars. "This watch is worth more than you'll make in 10 years. I'll give you this, plus the money, plus whatever else you want." The crowd was no longer just disapproving, they were actively hostile. The morning's entertainment had turned into something ugly, something that made everyone uncomfortable. Parents were pulling their children away, tourists were backing toward the street, and the locals were making their feelings known in increasingly colorful language. Calloway remained unmoved. If anything, his posture had become even more rigid, even more perfect. He was a rock against which Sterling's desperation was breaking like waves against a cliff. A group of teenagers near the front started chanting, "Piss off, piss off, piss off, off." The chant was taken up by others, growing louder and more insistent. Sterling spun around, trying to identify the source, but it was everywhere now. "This is insane," he screamed over the noise. "You're all insane. It's just a job. It's just a bloody job." That's when someone from the crowd threw something. Not at Calloway, but at Sterling. It was just a crumpled piece of paper, probably a discarded tourist map, but it hit him square in the chest. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Sterling staggered backward, looking around at the hostile faces surrounding him. For the first time, he seemed to realize that his money, his status, his entire identity, counted for nothing here. These people didn't care who he was or what he was worth. They cared about what he was doing, and they didn't like it. More objects started flying. Nothing dangerous, just trash from the street, but each piece carried the weight of collective disapproval. Sterling's bodyguards, who had been standing by his car looking increasingly uncomfortable, finally moved in. "Sir," one of them said, grabbing Sterling's arm, "we should go. Now." Sterling shook him off, but his fight was gone. He looked back at Calloway one last time, his face a mask of defeat and confusion. "This isn't over," he muttered, though whether to Calloway or to himself was unclear. The bodyguards managed to get Sterling back to his car, though not without him continuing to shout about peasants and fools and people who didn't understand the value of money. The Rolls-Royce peeled away from the curb with the same aggressive roar it had arrived with, but this time there was desperation in the sound rather than arrogance. As the car disappeared around the corner, the crowd slowly began to disperse. Some lingered, still talking about what they'd witnessed, but most seemed eager to move on from the unpleasant spectacle. The morning's entertainment had left everyone feeling slightly soiled, as if they'd witnessed something they wished they hadn't. But not everyone was ready to leave. A small group remained, positioned respectfully near Calloway's post. They weren't trying to interact with him or get his attention. They were just there, bearing witness to something important. The old veteran I'd mentioned earlier was among them. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at Calloway with obvious respect. A few other men who looked like they might have military backgrounds had joined him, forming an informal honor guard around the official one. A young boy, maybe 10 years old, approached slowly. He was carrying a small British flag, the kind sold at tourist shops around the city. He walked up to where the torn money still lay on the ground, picked up the pieces, and carefully placed them in a nearby trash bin. Then he stood back and saluted. It was a child's salute, imperfect and uncertain, but it carried more dignity than anything Sterling had done that morning. Calloway's eyes didn't move from their fixed point, but there was something different about his expression, a slight softening around the eyes perhaps, or maybe it was just the morning light. The boy held his salute for a full 10 seconds, then lowered his arm and walked back to his parents. His mother was crying, not from sadness but from something else. Pride, maybe, or hope. As the minutes passed, more people began to approach, not to bother Calloway or try to get his attention, but simply to acknowledge what he represented. A businessman in an expensive suit laid a single flower at the base of the guard post. A group of university students stood in respectful silence for several minutes before moving on. An elderly woman, probably in her 80s, walked up with the help of a walking stick. She didn't say anything, didn't try to interact with Calloway, but she stood there for a long time, looking at him with a kind of expression that spoke of profound gratitude. When she finally turned to leave, she whispered something that only those nearby could hear. "Thank you." The morning sun was getting higher now, burning off the autumn chill and casting new shadows across the palace grounds. The usual rhythm of tourist activity was resuming, but there was something different about it. People were more respectful, more aware of what they were looking at. The guards weren't just tourist attractions anymore. They were symbols of something important, something that couldn't be bought or sold. I stayed longer than I'd originally planned, fascinated by the aftermath of what I'd witnessed. The story was writing itself in my head, but I knew it was about more than just one billionaire's embarrassing morning. It was about values, about what we choose to honor and what we choose to reject. Around noon, during the changing of the guard ceremony, I noticed something interesting. The crowd was larger than usual, and more attentive. Word of the morning's events had spread, and people wanted to see these soldiers who couldn't be bought. They watched the ceremony with a reverence that seemed deeper than usual, as if they were witnessing something sacred. Calloway was relieved by another guard during the ceremony, but he didn't leave immediately. He stood at attention while his replacement took position, then executed a perfect about-face and marched toward the palace. As he passed the spot where Sterling had scattered his money, he paused for just a moment. It was barely perceptible, but I caught it. Then he continued on, his bearing as perfect as ever, leaving behind a crowd that had learned something important about dignity, duty, and the things that truly matter. The story didn't end there, of course. In our digital age, nothing ever really ends. Within hours, videos of the confrontation were all over social media. Someone had live-streamed the entire thing, and it was going viral faster than anyone could have predicted. The hashtag dignity not for sale was trending within hours. Memes featuring Sterling's red face and Calloway's stoic expression were being shared millions of times. But more than that, the story had sparked a conversation about values, about what we choose to honor in our society. Sterling's social media accounts were flooded with criticism. His business partnerships were being questioned. Several major clients announced they were reviewing their relationships with his company. The man who had thought he could buy anything had learned that some things come with a price he wasn't prepared to pay. Meanwhile, Calloway became an overnight hero. Not that he would have wanted it or sought it, but the public needed someone to rally around. He represented something pure in a world that often felt corrupt, something honorable in a time when honor seemed in short supply. The palace issued a brief statement later that day, commending the professionalism of their guards and noting that they served the crown with distinction regardless of external pressures. It was diplomatic language, but the message was clear. They were proud of their soldier. In the days that followed, the story took on a life of its own. News outlets around the world picked it up, not just as a curiosity but as a symbol of something larger. In an era of increasing cynicism about public institutions and public service, here was a man who had stood firm in his duty, regardless of the consequences. Letters began arriving at the palace from around the world. Most were addressed simply to the guard who couldn't be bought or the soldier at the gate. They came from veterans, from active military personnel, from ordinary citizens who wanted to express their admiration for what Calloway had done. Children sent drawings of soldiers standing guard. Elderly people wrote about family members who had served and how proud they were to see that tradition of honor continuing. Young people wrote about how the story had changed their perception of what it means to serve something greater than yourself. Sterling, meanwhile, had retreated from public view. His company's stock price had taken a hit, and several major deals had fallen through. More importantly, he had become a pariah in the social circles that had once welcomed him. Wealth might open doors, but it couldn't erase the image of him screaming at a soldier who refused to be bought. I heard through various sources that he had tried to make amends, to somehow repair the damage to his reputation. There were rumors of charitable donations, of attempts to meet with military leaders, of public relations firms being hired to rehabilitate his image. But some things can't be fixed with money, and this was one of them. The guard post at Buckingham Palace became something of a pilgrimage site, not in any official capacity, but in the way that certain places become meaningful to people. Tourists would stand there a little longer, speak a little more quietly, and seem to understand that they were in the presence of something important. Calloway himself continued his duties as if nothing had happened. He rotated through his shifts, performed his ceremonial duties, and maintained the same perfect bearing he'd always had. If the attention bothered him, he gave no sign of it. If he was proud of what he'd done, he kept that to himself as well. That's the thing about true dignity, I realized. It doesn't seek recognition or reward. It simply is. It exists in the quiet moments, in the choices we make when we think no one is watching, in the principles we hold, even when they cost us something. Months later, I had the opportunity to speak with some of Calloway's fellow guards. They were reluctant to discuss the incident directly, maintaining the discretion that's part of their training. But they painted a picture of a man who had always embodied the values he'd displayed that morning. James never made a big deal of it, one of them told me, speaking on condition of anonymity. To him, it was just another day at work. Someone tried to get him to break protocol, and he didn't. That's all it was to him. But it was more than that, of course. It was a reminder that in a world where everything seems to be for sale, some things remain priceless. It was a demonstration that dignity isn't about what you have, but about what you refuse to give up. The story had international repercussions as well. Military leaders around the world cited the incident as an example of the kind of professionalism and dedication they expected from their own forces. The video was used in training programs, not as entertainment but as a teaching tool about maintaining composure under pressure. Sterling eventually returned to public life, though his reputation never fully recovered. He became more careful about his public statements, more conscious of how his actions might be perceived. Whether this represented genuine growth or simply better public relations management was unclear, but the change was noticeable. The incident also sparked broader conversations about wealth inequality, about the relationship between money and power, about what we value as a society. Academic papers were written about it, sociologists analyzed it, and political commentators used it as a lens through which to examine larger social issues. But perhaps the most important impact was on the individuals who witnessed it, either in person or through the viral video. For many, it was a reminder that ordinary people can do extraordinary things simply by standing up for what they believe in. For others, it was a wake-up call about the corrosive effects of unchecked wealth and privilege. The torn £100 note, which had been thrown away that morning, became a symbol in its own right. Someone had retrieved it from the trash, and it eventually found its way to a military museum, where it was displayed alongside other artifacts of service and sacrifice. As I write this, years later, the story of that morning outside Buckingham Palace continues to resonate. It's been told and retold countless times, each telling emphasizing different aspects of what happened. Some focus on Sterling's comeuppance, others on Calloway's dignity, still others on the crowd's reaction. But for me, the most important part of the story is what it revealed about the choices we make and the values we hold. In a single moment, two men revealed who they really were. One chose to use his wealth as a weapon, trying to force someone to compromise their principles. The other chose to stand firm, regardless of the cost. The morning had started like any other, with tourists and locals going about their daily routines, but it ended with everyone who was there understanding something fundamental about human nature, about the difference between price and value, about the things that truly matter. Calloway retired from the Queen's Guard a few years later, though he remained in military service. He never gave interviews about the incident, never tried to capitalize on his moment of fame. He simply continued to serve, quietly and with dignity, the way he always had. Sterling's business empire continued to thrive, though he never again achieved the level of social acceptance he'd once enjoyed. He learned to be more careful about his public behavior, but whether he truly understood the lesson of that morning was unclear. The guard post at Buckingham Palace remains unchanged, a symbol of continuity and tradition in an ever-changing world. New guards take their positions there every day, carrying on the same duties that Calloway performed, holding themselves to the same standards he embodied, and sometimes, on quiet mornings, when the autumn air bites just enough to make you appreciate the warmth of your coffee, I find myself walking past that spot and remembering what I witnessed there. The day when money met principle, when privilege encountered dignity, when a billionaire learned that some things truly cannot be bought. The lesson of that morning wasn't complicated. It wasn't about politics or economics or social theory. It was about something much simpler and much more profound. The idea that we all have choices to make about who we want to be, and that those choices define us more than any amount of wealth or status ever could. In the end, Max Sterling III had everything money could buy, but he learned that morning that it couldn't buy him the one thing he really needed: respect. And Corporal James Calloway, who had nothing but his uniform and his oath, possessed something that no amount of money could purchase: dignity. That's the story of the morning when a billionaire thought he could buy the Royal Guard, and why his ego was destroyed in seconds. But more than that, it's a story about the things that matter most in this world, and the courage it takes to stand up for them when it would be easier to give in. The legacy of that morning continues to inspire people around the world. It's a reminder that in a time when everything seems to be for sale, some things remain priceless. It's a testament to the power of ordinary people to do extraordinary things, simply by refusing to compromise their principles. And it's a story that will be told for generations to come. because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature and the choices we make when we think no one is watching. In the end, character isn't about what you have or what you've accomplished. It's about who you are when the moment of truth arrives. That morning, outside Buckingham Palace, two men faced their moment of truth. One failed spectacularly, while the other stood firm. The difference between them wasn't money or status or privilege. It was simply this: one knew who he was and what he stood for, while the other discovered that all his wealth couldn't buy him the one thing he really needed. The guard post still stands. The tradition continues. And somewhere in London, a retired soldier goes about his daily life, probably unaware that he's become a symbol of something larger than himself. Because that's what dignity looks like: quiet, unassuming, and absolutely unshakable. The story ends where it began, with a simple truth: some things cannot be bought, no matter how much money you have. And sometimes, it takes a moment of crisis to remind us what those things are.